Good morning and welcome to our study of the Bodhisattva Guide. So, as always, kindly generate the motivation of bodhicitta. Particularly then, you could say the courage that lies in the bodhicitta motivation, which is actually vastly beyond what we ordinarily think in terms of, because it quite literally means I alone shall establish all sentient beings at the level of enlightenment. So this is the kind of motivation that drives the Bodhisattva. So that's what we bring to this study. So as we'll start with the generating the motivation, and then quoting from the Vinaya and the Prajnaparamita. Then we follow up with what we call refuge and bodhicitta. Abandon evil doing, practice virtue well, subdue your mind. This is the Buddha's teaching. Like a star, an optical illusion or a flame, a magical illusion, a dewdrop or a bubble, like a dream, a flash of lightning or a cloud, so should one consider all compounded things. In the Buddha, the Dharma, the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. Oh, by the way, if you're wondering where this is actually at the opening of the pilgrimage of Mount Kailash. So when you do this pilgrimage, this is generally regarded as the place you begin. You go through. There's probably some practice of going through this under this stupa. I'm not exactly sure. And also, this is a place where people do a lot of smoke offerings. So the Kailash pilgrimage is full of Buddhists, obviously, and also Hindus, because this is also sacred to Shiva and Parvati, and the Bumpos as well. So you have this wonderful situation as a Buddhist when you circumambulate, then you meet all the Bumpos that are coming the other way. Which is very interesting. Anyway, it's a beautiful trek, beautiful pilgrimage. No, I didn't take this picture. Okay, so presently we are studying the chapter on endeavor, the application of the path. And that's where we very often as practitioners, we think, I'm not practicing the way I should do. And that's how it has always been, because we're habituated to come back again and again to our sort of unconscious, mindless, habitual patterns. But then again, we regain mindfulness. Simple as that. We don't have to have there's actually some pith instructions in the lineage. We always refer to them as such, which is the moment that we have mindfulness, there shouldn't be some sort of ensuing narrative, or it might happen, but we shouldn't take it too seriously, that goes, gosh, there I was mindless again. There should be some kind of determination to sustain mindfulness. But then again, the moment that we recognize that we have been mindless and lost mindfulness, then it's just about getting back on track without too much elaboration or like that. Just simply do it. And so Shantideva says, if in the fray the soldier drops his sword in fright, he swiftly takes it up again. So likewise, if the arm of mindfulness is lost in fear of hell, I'll quickly get it back. So if we lose our mindfulness, we just get it back on track. We do so knowing exactly what mindlessness can bring about. In the nth degree, hell. And so the whole array of neurosis and how neurosis comes about is perfectly clear to us, and the ramifications of it. So it's lost mindfulness, get it back. Just like the warrior in the battlefield. So His Holiness says, such are the dangers of becoming too relaxed and losing mindfulness. Of course, we're not talking about there's a danger in becoming relaxed, but there's a place where relaxed turns into just being sloppy and careless, and that's the extreme. And so, on the other hand, it's becoming uptight and overly mindful, you could say attentive or mindful in a very rigid way. And that's also an extreme. So as you know from the pith instructions that we have, neither too loose nor too tight. Shantideva says, just as poison fills the body, borne on the current of the blood, likewise evil, when it finds its chance, will spread and permeate the mind. So again, we're not talking evil in an absolute sense, but we're talking about the toxicity that we are habituated to. And this comes about from the self-centering. Again, our unconsciousness in which we fixate and dramatize, etc., the issue of our self. And that is perpetuated by the blood of the narratives, the storylines that hopefully we're aware of. We're hopefully aware that we're thinking, we know what we're thinking. We're not particularly talking about the subconscious, but if we're mindful and we know what's happening with the mind, and that is where meditation also is very helpful. We begin to become aware of what's happening in the mind. Then we're aware how this succession of thoughts are like the blood that perpetuates this fixation. And so with the nature of self being that of suffering, then it's something that as soon as the opportunity is there, then it just takes over. So with that in mind, then His Holiness says, on how to actually practice mindfulness and attentiveness, Shantideva continues, I will be like a frightened man, a brimming oil jar in his hand, and menaced by a swordsman saying, spill one drop and you shall die. This is how practitioners should hold themselves. We might think, oh, that's a bit sort of over-dramatizing, isn't it? But it's just a question of knowing really what has value and what really is what brings us down. And that's where we should really apply ourselves, because right now we have an opportunity to free ourselves from a succession of sufferings and lifetimes of pain, where this is of such enormous, you could say, this is such an enormous opportunity. So we should keep this sort of attitude, like this is so important. Spill one drop and you shall die. That's like, yes, I'll do it. So we just need to think of the situation. It doesn't mean we need to sort of go into sort of this condition of abject fear, but it's more just that we have that determination to not squander this mindfulness. This is something that we have right now. There's nothing about mindfulness that we can't do in any given moment. Particularly Tsongkhapa Rinpoche, he's always emphasizing this is not something that just is done when we sit on the cushion. There's never ever a single moment where we cannot practice this. But it's so important that we do. Shantideva says, every time then that I fail, I will reprove and chide myself, thinking long that by whatever means such faults in future shall no more occur. So that's where, again, this is a little bit tricky, especially in the modern exposure of Buddhism and presentation of Buddhism, where sometimes there's a little bit sort of where sometimes there's a subtle balance implicit in this, where there's a rather robust mentality that's present within the traditional Buddhist cultures, that is not as if anybody's going to fall into sort of excessive, you could say self you know, blaming oneself and all of that. It's just being very commonsensical about what's what. So it's a bit like if we fail to pay taxes and we get a fine, then we say, okay, next year I'll definitely not forget, and so forth. So it's just being very, very practical. Incidentally, we're just reading Paul Trimbage's life story, and then in there there's a story of people who would come by Paul Trimbage's hermitage, and they would sometimes hear him scolding himself, you know, when he wasn't practicing well. But again, this is not something that sort of goes into something unhealthy or in any way, you could say, counterproductive. In some way, there's just this, possibly even a sense of humor, just knowing what is it I'm doing, honestly, you know, let's get it together, that sort of thing. But aware that this is a crucial moment. So Shantideva says, at all times and in any situation, how can I make my mindfulness my constant habit? Thinking thus, I will desire to meet with teachers and fulfill the proper tasks. So we recognize what is going to help, and we realize meeting with teachers, practicing, and so forth is something that really brings about the effect, which is us increasingly becoming more and more conscious, more and more unaware, and less unconscious, less and less mindless. His Holiness says, once we're able to practice mindfulness and attentiveness in what we do, we will never become tired or disheartened. We will always be prepared to continue. Shantideva says, just as flaxen threads waft to and fro, impelled by every breath of wind, so all I do will be achieved, controlled by movements of a joyful heart. So the nature of mindfulness is this joyful heart. There's never ever a time that we're sort of like overwhelmed and so on. And we might be overwhelmed just momentarily. And then the practice comes back and we know exactly how to deal then with the situation. We apply the teaching. And this way, there's never really ever a time where we become disheartened. There's continually this vision of can do, the joyful heart. His Holiness says, spiritual practice is difficult in the beginning. You wonder how on earth you can ever do it. But as you get used to it, this practice gradually becomes easier. Do not be too stubborn or push yourself too hard. If you practice in accord with your individual capacity, little by little, you will find more pleasure and joy in it. As you gain inner strength, your positive actions will gain in profundity and scope. So these sort of last lines here, they sort of bring back this to the middle way. But there is very much this sense that without endeavor, without application, then nothing is going to move. And that's why, again, we have a little bit of a cultural habit in the modern world where there's not really a notion of enlightenment, there's not really a notion of the path. There's a notion that you could belong to a particular belief system. And then you sign up at the church and you're part of a particular movement with its own particular opinion. And that then is what is understood as a path. And that's why we have a very long tradition of that kind of essentially just looking for some parental figure in the terms of an organization or some sense of belonging that just we can use as something to give our existence value, or something that relieves our pain or gives us hope and all that kind of stuff, which is a very small and very sad place to be. And you can't blame that nowadays, then many people, they refuse to be associated with that kind of weakness. You know, Nietzsche and the superhuman and the slave human and all of that. So there's very much sort of a sense of not wanting to be part of something like that. But nevertheless, it's interesting that when we come to the spiritual path, there's very often this sense that, well, now I've taken refuge, I've become a member of the church, and I'm doing all I'm supposed to do. then still there's the actual practice of the path still remains to begin, because this is where there's something entirely radical that needs to take place, which is this moment by moment application. And that's the path. Until then, however many Buddhist pictures or guru pictures we have and so forth, it doesn't really make that much difference. Of course, it's all very good in terms of planting seeds of merit and so forth, but it's so important that there's the application. And then again, the application, and that's where His Holiness ends on this beautiful, you could say, middle way note. It has to be done with ease, with gentleness, with elegance, with smoothness, not too stubborn, not pushing ourselves too hard, but there's something still has to be happening. This, of course, has to be done according to how we individually are able to do it. But there is a journey, and that's why this journey increasingly brings about joy. So this is the chapter on endeavor. So the 6 paramitas, they work really in terms of increasing profundity. So the first one, generosity; the second one, discipline, patience, endeavor. These are progressively more profound. And now we come to one that's, again, more profound again. That is working, again, like we've just been talking about here in terms of mindfulness and awareness. This is the practice of meditation. And that's where we have a practice of familiarizing ourselves. And that's where it is easy. It is easier to do meditation sitting on a cushion. We shouldn't think that meditation is only sitting on the cushion. But it is that place where we make it easier for ourselves. But meditation is then this practice where we are proactive in becoming more aware, proactive in no longer sort of being stuck in unconsciousness, mindlessness. So Shantideva says, cultivating diligence, as just described, in concentration I will place my mind. For those whose minds are slack and wandering are caught between the fangs of the afflictions. So, on the basis of the discussion we've just had, we have this determination to practice meditation, and we also recognize the faults, the difficulties with not having a mind that's settled, and we know what happens with the mind that's not settled. So His Holiness comments, to strengthen our practice, it's necessary to develop one-pointed concentration of the mind. For this, we first need to understand the disadvantages of being distracted. Lack of concentration prevents us from keeping our minds focused on the object of meditation. The mind follows any thoughts that arise, and it is then all too easy for negative emotions to grow. So this is really it. We need to understand what actually happens with our mind in terms of the thoughts and how we find ourselves in particular negative states of mind that don't just come about like this, and they're not just sort of, we can't blame it on the externals, you know, that person out there makes me feel awful, or this circumstance makes me feel awful. It's entirely on the basis of our interpretation of a particular situation that we begin to have aversion, and that's not going to help. And then we have thoughts of aversion that we perpetuate. And then all of a sudden it has a grip that sort of goes right into our gut where we feel terrible. And we then blame the external circumstances. But it's actually our interpretation of the circumstances. We're not talking about all of a sudden being unconscious, saying, oh, what was bad is not bad. Somebody's negative. We're all of a sudden saying, no, that person's not negative. This person's a wonderful person. We're not saying that. But we are identifying how we fail to relate clearly to the situation on the basis of our thoughts that stand in reaction. And that's entirely our thoughts that judge and interpret a given event in a particular way. Otherwise, we're usually much more able to deal with situation with equanimity. So if there is a negative situation, we can deal with it clearly, properly, and eliminate the causes of the negativity, or at least work towards it much more effectively. But if we're caught up in interpreting things and labeling things as negative, and we perpetuate that narrative that's where thoughts get a grip on us. And this transmits into the somatic aspect of how we feel, the sort of gut-wrenching experience of emotion and so forth. So that's where we know what the mind, the distracted mind, is capable of doing. And that is where meditation is what actually enables us to not just moralistically say, oh, I shouldn't be so caught up in my negative thoughts, because that's not going to be anything other than thoughts fighting with thoughts. But meditation is where there's a space of openness in which we're not conditioned by the thoughts. And that's what we need to familiarize ourselves with. So as a consequence also of being held by negative emotions, His Holiness comments, any positive actions we do will not realize their full effect. So even if we do good things, if there's still this sort of undertow of negative attitudes and storylines and so forth, then even if we do positive things, they don't really have that much of an impact. So the bottom line here is this condition of distraction. His Holiness says distraction is therefore a major defect and is very important to counteract it by developing mental calm, shamatha. So shamatha is sitting meditation, again, something that we don't have a history of in our culture, and yet there is a wisdom that we know that is about calmness helps. Within a condition of calm, there's clarity. We are more attracted to the advice of calm people than agitated people. And we also know that when we take some time off and settle, then calm happens. But so we are familiar with, you could say, the logic and the dynamic of calm. But in the Buddhist teaching, there's a proactive cultivation of calm, which we call shamatha. And this is very different from just calm happening sort of when it could, or, you know, on the basis of a weekend or happy hour or whatever. It's something that we actually have as a practice of personal hygiene, just like we shower, just like we brush our teeth, and know that if we don't brush our teeth, that has consequences. We also then are proactive in having a regular practice of establishing mental calm. His Holiness says, the practice of mental calm is not unique to Buddhism. Non-Buddhist traditions include methods for developing mental calm through which it's possible to attain the state of concentration of the formless celestial beings, devas, in the realm of nothing at all. So we have, for example, in systems of yoga, the practice of like Raj Yoga, where you have the dwelling within samadhi, in which there's no notion of anything that arises. And this we call the formless realms. So we sometimes talk about samsara in terms of the three realms. There's the desire realm, in which we continually are operating with striving towards what we want and battling against what we don't want. And that's the vast majority of the population of samsara really is experiencing that. Then we have the form realm, which is then celestial experiences based on sublime, you could say, paths of ethics and so forth. And then you have the very, very profound worldly practices of just dwelling in samadhi. And so there is one then of the realms in which these celestial beings of the formless realm abide, which is called nothing at all, Chiang Meba. The realm of nothing at all is one of the four formless worlds or realms at the summit of cyclic existence, experienced through the four formless absorptions, said to be attained by practitioners of the Brahma vehicle. Being in these worlds have temporarily suppressed gross negative emotions, but their minds are still pervaded by ignorance, and they lack any realization of selflessness. For this reason, they cannot escape from samsara and continue to take rebirth in the lower realms. So that basically is the spiritual path in its most sublime form, but linked up to the agenda of self. So there's no notion of no self. There's simply just the notion of, if I stay calm with no thoughts, that's bliss. So that's entirely based on the self. That's entirely based on ego. And that's why there's no end of samsara in that kind of path at all. But it is a state then of samadhi that can endure for a very, very long time. So His Holiness continues, in this state, negative emotions are allayed, but not entirely eliminated. They remain latent. Mental calm on its own, therefore, is not uniquely special. But this one-pointed concentration is very important in developing fully the power of positive actions, and it is crucial for our practice of clear insight, vipassana. So as much as this is not something that's uniquely Buddhist, it's something that's really, really important. That's why, we very often look to people who might not be Buddhist and says, gosh, that person is just such a saintly, wonderful person, and so on. So that's where this is something universal. Calm is just something that's really, really helpful. In terms of the Buddhist path, which is then the insight into no self and the insight into, you could say, insight beyond the ordinary bubble of ignorance, then essential for that is the practice of vipassana. That is where we begin to wake up. It's not just that we're in a comfortable dream, but we're actually literally waking up. And so that's where for us to properly cultivate this vipassana, which is insight, it's enormously helped if there is this mental calm. His Holiness says the Madhyamika view, which is common to both Sutrayana and Mantrayana, is established through analytical reasoning until we obtain certainty in it. So then there's a reference to, I think, Nagarjuna. The Madhyamika view is the view of the middle way, introduced by Nagarjuna. It's discussed more fully in the chapter 9 of the Bodhicharyavatara. Yeah, chapter 9 will be big on this. And so this is basically, you could say, the vipassana that is found all across Buddhism, the Sutrayana, the Mantrayana, and so on. And that initially begins with a critique of our understanding. It's not about believing anything. It's about us beginning to look at the beliefs we already had. And that's where it's the middle way that takes us out of the extremes that we normally are habituated to hang on to. We'd like to think this, or we'd like to think that, or so forth. Our opinions, our philosophies, and all of that, which are all just essentially something that happens at the level of thoughts. It doesn't really do us much good in terms of our actual experience. So that's where the Buddha, strangely enough, in the middle way teaching, takes us beyond any addiction to dogma or fixation. And that's why the middle way is radical. But there's, of course, two kinds of middle ways. There's the middle way of words, and then there's the middle way of experience. So the words are the critique. That's where we dismantle our assumptions. And the experience then is the practice of meditation, where we begin to then open up and relinquish unawareness altogether. So this is then where the foundation of mental calm is very, very helpful. So when we approach this, the middle way and the practice of vipassana, we initially do that on the basis of analysis, and then gradually less and less analysis, and more simply just settling. So His Holiness says, referring to the Madhyamika view and vipassana, this is something very subtle, and unless our power of concentration is stable, there is a danger of losing this view of emptiness. And again, with emptiness, we don't mean nothing, but we mean this fact that nothing can be grasped. The nature of reality is such that we can't grasp it. It doesn't have the solidity that we ordinarily project onto it. And that's where we need to get used to this. It's a bit like growing up. We find out that certain things that we just cannot hold on to as much as we'd like. And the nature of reality is such that it doesn't have the solidity that we very often consolidate our sense of existence on the basis of. So in terms of remedying this, then His Holiness says the more stable our concentration is, the clearer will be our understanding of emptiness. What do we mean by meditation? First, there is meditation through analysis, whereby we repeatedly examine an object until we gain a degree of certainty concerning its nature. When we cannot proceed any further with analysis, we let ourselves repose in a state of clarity and confidence that we have achieved. This is placement meditation. So the first is analytical meditation. We analyze, we can take an object, we can take something like this watch, and we can say, where is the essence of this watch? And we'll never find it. All we'll see is an aggregation of little particles or elements that again in and of themselves are again constituted. And ultimately we just have a set of relationships that is labeled as a particular object, but there's no intrinsic, unchanging essence in this to be found anywhere. And that's analytical meditation. We do this with object, the objective phenomena, and we do this with the subject, the internal observer, the person that we say me about. So that's where we apply analytical meditation. Then we, like His Holiness says, then we settle into a state of clarity and confidence, simplicity. And that's where we refer to this, we refer to as placement meditation. So in Tibetan, Chegom, meaning analytical meditation, and Jogom, settling or placement meditation. So His Holiness says, with regards to the latter, it is the latter type of meditation that is used in practices, such as visualizing deities and training in mental calm, where one is developing the power of concentration. So when it comes to sitting meditation, we just practice settling the mind, being properly present and aware. And similarly also the practices of yoga, as we have it in the Vajrayana, the practice of the yoga of deity in terms of visualization, the practice of mantra in terms of purifying the speech, and the yoga of the mind, settling as we are describing it here in mental calm, endowed with this quality of being awake. So in this way, whatever we're doing when we practice this kind of meditation, it constitutes what we call placement meditation. But it's very important that we initially have gone through this analysis to actually arrive at a point where we see what's real and what's not real. And we're no longer deceived. This is so important. Otherwise, we're just like naive persons that just fail to understand the nature of our reality. Now, His Holiness says, and this is quite important, of course, he says, one can also meditate on devotion in order to understand and increase it, or on impermanence, where one contemplates an object and the way in which it is constantly changing, or on emptiness, realizing that the object has no true existence. So devotion is something that brings about the result of both shamatha and vipassana, mental calm and insight, because that's a place where we intuitively sense the awakened condition as it manifests in the teacher, in someone external to us, or even thinking about the great sages of the past, men and women of the past. And the moment that we invoke the presence of this person, there's the sense of their greatness. And in this, we have both the focus of the mind and also the falling away of the ordinary kinds of concerns. So that's where devotion, we're not just talking idolatry or thinking, wow, this person is great, but it's this place where we're deeply touched in the heart. What in Sanskrit is called bhakti, this deep sense of surrender to someone that has these qualities. So this is a very living thing. This is much less, you could say, cerebral or analytical than what we generally describe in the Buddhist teaching. And this is crucial, particularly in the Vajrayana, for us to really understand how to integrate the yoga of the Vajrayana. And then, of course, we can also meditate on impermanence. Again, we tend to be naively sort of fixated and seduced by appearances and think that this will bring us happiness, something. And we realize it's constantly changing. Our situation, things, people, and so forth, this life. And then emptiness, again, this analysis that sees that everything is nothing but a web of dependent arising. So His Holiness says there are so many ways to describe the perception of things. In meditation, it's important to be able to distinguish between the perceived object, the object in itself, the object as it is considered to be, and the object of intention. Okay, this is Buddhist epistemology for you. These are the four ways of perceiving an object. Okay. So one thing is what we know. This is a biggie in I'll look up Anne Klein's comments on this, by the way. But just briefly summing up this here, because I'm at this point I'm not entirely certain around these 4 points, but just something that's basic to Buddhist epistemology, Buddhist science of knowledge. How do we know something? Well, we can see that when we have an object, then there is our perception of an object, but there's also the object itself. You know, it's like when a friend that we have and we say, you know, you think like this, we say to the friend, you are like that. And the person says, I'm not who you think I am. That sort of thing. Well, same with any object that we perceive. We're actually not touching the object itself. We're really just stuck in our perception. So that's why we need to distinguish between the object itself and our perception. And so then also there is some subtleties here that I'll look up, which is the object as it's considered to be and the object of intention. Okay, to be returned to. So he says we should study also study the 5 defects to be avoided in calm mental meditation. Mentioned in the treatise on the center and extremes. Okay, these 5 defects I can upload to the the 5 defects that interrupt mental calm are laziness, forgetting the instruction on meditation, dullness, and being distracted by thoughts of attachment, lack of effort, and overexertion. Yeah. So you have this described very well in the Lobsang Lhalongpa's Mahamudra. That's really a wonderful book on meditation, by the way. And also I'll upload a little chart, because these 5, they're remedied by what we call the 8 remedies then. So these stand sort of in juxtaposition. I'll upload a little chart that gives an overview of that. So His Holiness says, in brief, meditation is a way of training and transforming the mind. And this it certainly does. For our purposes, the main thing is to develop the one-pointed concentration on mental calm and to meditate on bodhicitta. For concentration to become clear, we need to have the right conditions, namely freedom from outer distractions. The ideal is to meditate in a secluded place that is conducive to physical and mental serenity. So this is where we have, as His Holiness, according to His Holiness advice, really 2 things that we should focus on. One is the mental calm, and the other is the greatness of mind of bodhicitta, this quality that is not concerned merely about ourselves, but also very much looks to the welfare of others. But for the first then, for the mind to be calm, then it's good to have a secluded place to go to. Now this, of course, is something that in our culture, again, is not that common. You can say our culture is fairly innocent and new to the idea of enlightenment. And so you could say the parameters are not that common, the context and the necessary conditions are not that easily found, a place where we can go and meditate. So what we need to do also is very much have the view that when we hear about the values of going to secluded places, we should also think of this in terms of our own cushion, in terms of us setting certain boundaries. I meditate from this time to that time. And it's not only about telling others, getting away from the world, but it's also about us, ourselves, and making a decision to actually abide by a particular discipline and setting our own boundaries just in terms of our time and our attention. Anyway, Shantideva will now make a strong pitch for the for the practice of going to places that are helpful. And of course, a lot of us are familiar with this. Because of loved ones and desire for gain, we fail to turn away from worldly things. These then are the first things to renounce. The prudent should conduct themselves like this. Penetrative insight, joined with calm abiding, utterly eradicates afflicted states. Knowing this, first search for calm abiding, found by people who are happy to be free from worldly ties. If I crave for other beings, a veil is cast upon the perfect truth. Wholesome disillusion melts away, and finally there comes the sting of pain. My thoughts are all for them, and thus my life is frittered by. My family and friends all change and pass, for whom the changeless Dharma is cast out. So this is pretty radical. This is actually encouraging us to prioritize, not giving up love for others, but giving up what distracts us from actually becoming effective in benefiting others. So for us to actually have the right circumstances to cut through confusion and truly become someone that can be there for others, we need to first focus on the matter at hand, which is dealing with our personal confusion and unveiling this potential we have for benefiting others. And so just like when we go and study at university, then there's a period where we need to simply just focus on the subject matter, and that's where partying down and all the sort of various distractions that are tempting, they're also known to be not particularly helpful for that process. And so similarly also in terms of us leading a life, then there is this emphasis that it's helpful for us to really prioritize the spiritual path. So then here there's a famous line that's very often quoted: penetrative insight joined with calm abiding utterly eradicates afflicted states. So the insight that we have on the basis of our analysis, joined together with the mind that rests, this is what will bring about the awakening. So this is where then there's an emphasis on the, or Shantideva stresses how our attachment and engagement and entanglement, as much as we sort of wish to be there for others, it's very often what brings about a distraction. And at the end of the day, that all we're left with is pain. So that's where we need to understand what is priority. The attachments and the objects of attachments that we have, they will all pass. Whereas the Dharma, which is changeless, it doesn't pass. And that's where we need to get our priorities right and understand what is it that truly is going to be of lasting value. So as Ola's comments, as we are impermanent, is it really worth being so attached to others who are also impermanent? Is it really worth getting angry with them? Let us reflect this and stop the stream of clinging and aversion. So again, this is spoken within a context in which there's an entire framework in place for individuals to do this, and where also there is a sort of, you could say, a cultural acknowledgement of the value of this. It's a little bit more difficult in the modern context, where it's not likely that the society necessarily appreciates and understands this path, and also where the circumstances are not necessarily that easily found. But nevertheless, I hope it's clear the wisdom that's implicit in this. And this, of course, also explains the particular practices that we see in Buddhist cultures and also in the lives of great masters. Any questions? Okay, I'll continue a little bit. So Shantideva says, for if I act like childish beings, sure it is that I shall fall to evil destinies. So why do I keep company with infants who lead me to a state so far from virtue? His Holiness comments, ordinary beings dominated by gross attachment and hatred are like children. If we behave like them, we will not achieve anything for ourselves, and it will be impossible for us to benefit them. One minute they are our friends, the next they turn against us. However hard we try, it's difficult to please them. And when we do not listen to them, they become angry. So this is where there's not that others are bad, but it's simply just the confusion. We of course understand all beings at all times, everywhere, are innocent. There's not bad people out there as such. But due to confusion, then everyone spins off in their own particular style of neurosis and their own particular patterns. And in that, there's very little wisdom. And so what the general condition of sentient beings is this continual condition of attachment and hatred. So it's very difficult to please everybody when this is their, you could say, fundamental disposition. And so things are always changing, as we can see in the world. In some way, this is only too obvious. Shantideva says, keep company with them, and what will follow? Self-aggrandizement and scorn for others, talk about the good things of samsara. Every kind of vice is sure to come. Only ruin can result from such a link between myself and others, for they will bring no benefit to me, and I, in turn, can do them nothing good. So the spirit here is reflected in the life of the great sages of the past. Again, this is not about all of a sudden being down on people or not sort of understanding the illusory nature of phenomena ultimately, but it is about understanding the ways of the world and just being savvy in terms of the reality of things, not the ideal of things, because we very often become rather idealistic. Simply just seeing what truly happens in the life of others, ourselves, and so forth. And that's where we can see how circumstances, they very well can just lead us from one thing to the other, in which just opportunity is lost. So His Holiness says, it's therefore better to keep our distance from such beings. In doing so, however, we should avoid offending them. And when we do meet them, we should be courteous and do what we can to make them happy without becoming too familiar. So this again we can see in the life of sages. The sages of the past, they were never revolutionaries in this sort of aggressive sense of battling and tearing down things and destroying and alienating themselves. They very politely exited. They very politely sort of says, I might just withdraw for some time, but never ever in an absolute sense. So there's always the commitment to sentient beings, but just understanding that it might be helpful. And we can look in again in the life of someone like Palterinbridge, who was from a very early age, naturally very spiritual, and yet chose a lifestyle of tremendous simplicity. And what was the outcome of that simplicity? Well, it's actually that simplicity in which he lived as a hermit, as a vagabond, and all of that. It's not as if he just didn't have an impact. He had an enormous impact. This also we can see then in Buddhist cultures. The hermits have an enormous impact in terms of guiding others, in terms of helping persons find genuine happiness. And so that's where the spiritual path is never ever about conforming to the expectations of ordinary society. So that's where simply just keeping a friendly relationship with anyone without becoming too attached. This is very much the example we see in the lifestyle of great masters. You mentioned a book on meditation. What's the book? Did I mention a book on meditation? Which one? Which one was that? Book on meditation. Just now? Oh, sorry. Yes. Yes. His Holiness was mentioning. Yes, it's a book by someone called Takpo Tashi Namgyal, and it's called Mahamudra. I have it here somewhere. It's a bit of a brick, but it's a wonderful book, a classical presentation from of Mahamudra. Yeah, and it was translated by a very good Tibetan translator, spoke very good English. Yeah, Moonlight of Mahamudra, Lobsang Shalompa. Since then, there's been other translations of this book as well. But it is very classical, but it's a great reference book. I would also say, in terms of approaching meditation, combining, you could say, a work like that with also a contemporary work like Chögyam Trungpa's mindfulness in action. Again, not meditation in action, but mindfulness in action. So you could say a very classical presentation, a very thorough presentation is the Moonlight of Mahamudra, or Moonbeams of Mahamudra, and then mindfulness in action. Yeah. Thank you. I met the translator once, Lobsang Lalumpa, in a Mexican in a Mexican restaurant in Santa Fe. Very, very nice man, very refined Central Tibetan, very beautiful man, very intelligent, and his work there, the translation is very beautiful. Very one of these translations that strikes that fine line between being, you say, thorough in terms of presenting the all the aspects of the finesse and the sophistication of the subject matter, and also a language that's not overly academic or convoluted. So, very beautiful translation. A little bit more. We have 5 minutes to go. Okay. Like bees that get their honey from the flowers, take only what will serve the practice of the Dharma. Treat everyone like new acquaintances and keep yourself from close familiarity. Not getting too entangled. So His Holiness comments, let us not be attached to ephemeral pleasures. It is only ignorant and confused people who spend their time amassing possessions. They end up with suffering 1,000 times as great as the happiness they seek. Now, for that, we only need to look at the, you could say, array of contemporary arts, literature, movies, and so on that describe sort of the dramas of people's lives and so forth. And again, we again and again have this story about how someone does all sorts of things to amass possessions and end up miserable as a consequence of all the various actions. You know. So that's where we famously have the quote from Nagarjuna, and incidentally, almost verbatim also from Alfred Nobel, which is, of all the riches, the greatest is contentment. So Shantideva continues, since this is so, the wise have no attachments. From such cravings, fear and anguish come, and fix this firmly in your understanding. All that may be wished for will by nature fade to nothing. So everything that we that we have and love in terms of what's external objects and so forth, it's by nature impermanent, and in terms of its outer characteristic, and its actual essence is empty. For people may have gained great wealth or riches, enjoying reputation, sweet renown, but who can say where they have gone to now, with all the baggage of their gold and fame? So again, then, the superficial values of the world, of course, make a big deal out of all these things. And we habitually, we can't just point our finger to others and say, oh yeah, they're so materialistic, because it kind of sits in all of us, in greater or lesser extent, right? And yet we know it's so futile. So what has happened to all these people who amassed great wealth, were extremely famous? Where have they gone to now? What did all this stuff actually, where has that gone? So His Holiness comments, what point is there in hoping for people's approval and fearing their criticism? If a few people sing our praises, there is not much to be happy about, because there may be many more who are secretly criticizing us. We need not worry when a few criticize us, because there are others who have only praise for us. The wants and needs of others are so various that it is impossible for us ordinary beings to satisfy them all. Even the Buddhas themselves cannot do so. So it's better to distance ourselves from the childish and consider instead the advantages of living in solitude. So again, this is very much, you could say, the ethos and the spirit of masters like Shantideva and Paltrimbaja. And it's on the basis of this lifestyle that they achieved what it is that we take refuge in. In woodlands, haunt of stag and bird, among the trees where no dissension jars, it's there I would keep pleasant company. When might I be off to make my dwelling there? When shall I depart to make my home, in cave or empty shrine, or under spreading tree, with in my breast a free, unfettered heart, which never turns to cast a backward glance? And so it says, in such secluded places we can give up attachment to our belongings and bodies and devote all our time to meditation. When might I be free of fear, without the need to hide from anyone, with just a begging bowl and few belongings, dressed in garments coveted by none, like those who journeyed on the road, who pause and lodge along the way, beings on the pathways of existence, seize upon the lodging of their birth, until the time comes round when 4 men carry me away, amid the grief of worldly folk. Till then I will away and go into the forest. There, with no befriending or begrudging, I will stay alone in solitude, considered from the outset as already dead, thus when I die, a source of pain to none. So just as we sort of journey along lifetime after lifetime, yes, we might stop here just very briefly. This is then the lodging of our present birth. And here we are then until somebody carries us off. So this brief moment, Shantideva says, this brief moment, I'm going to do something which is really, really valuable. And that's where then, not in any way being, you could say, tied to this world, then it's just as if we're already dead. And then nobody will mourn us. There's a famous saying from the great Kadampa masters, I entrust my life to the Dharma. I entrust my Dharma to life in a cave. I entrust this life in an empty cave to death. I entrust this death to I can't remember. Basically, I entrust my life to the Dharma, and I entrust my Dharma to an empty cave, and I entrust the ultimate, you could say, point of life in that empty cave to dying there with nobody around. And that's the spirit of the sage, that simply has no concern, and really, as far as the objective of one's existence, is entirely dedicated to the Dharma, entirely different from the way that we ordinarily think of things in terms of our habitual, you could say, insecurity and need for comfort and so forth. So in that way, when I die, a source of pain to none. That's inspiring. Can you please share quote and resources? I entrust my life. Yes, it's quoted so often, and I really should be able to quote it. Okay, I'll put it up there in the resources. Yeah, I think it's, yeah, I'll put it up there probably as the four entrustments or something like that. Yeah. Okay, I'll find it. Okay. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, rise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we are born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we meet the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you.